첫 번째 세션으로 인터넷은 그 경제적 불평등을 해소할 수 있는가라는 주제로 우선 그 첫 번째 그 모나시 대학교 사회과학부 교수님의 사회과학부의 아이작 레데가드 교수님의 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 제목은 편안한 이방인 모시기, 공유경제에 담긴 사해주의적 욕망입니다.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. My research has mostly been on Airbnb, so I'll be talking about that research. This is me. This is the title of the paper and the presentation as well. I predict that some of the slides here will be, that the text font will be a bit larger on this computer than it was on my computer this morning for some reason. But I'll try to read out what you can see. So the research I'll be talking about here today is part of a larger MacArthur-founded project on the sharing economy, which I was part of when I did my PhD at Boston College. And I just want to mention that some of the research I'll be talking about is done in collaboration with the folks you see on this particular slide. So in this research project, we looked at numerous cases in the sharing economy, including Airbnb, which is what I'll be talking about. So I thought it would be a good idea just to start with the very, very basics. So how do sociologists think about technology and social change? I am a sociologist. So what we say is that thinking of information and communication technologies, or the internet to keep it simple, that technology when on in itself not really change anything at all. So technology will not change anything on its own. We also need to look at the social logics involved. We need to look at how the technology is used, who is using the technology, who has access to the technology, how is it implemented, how is it regulated, and so on. So when we talk about technology changing anything, we are also talking about the social logics. And research on technology and social change has in many cases found that the internet is in many cases reproducing the world as we already know it. So there's no complete reorganization in terms of how people have access to resources and so on. So inequality is in many cases simply reproduced with the technology we have access to. But in some cases, the combination of the internet and social logics will produce entirely new social dynamics. In some cases, technology will change how our societies are organized, right? So for people like me who are interested in social change and technology, a big part of that project is to figure out when the social world is simply reproduced and when new social dynamics emerge because of technology, okay? So one narrow question here that is related to this idea of social change and technology is, can the internet bring people together across difference? This relates to what's called contact theory, and that theory is pretty straightforward. It really just means that when people from different groups meet each other, when you meet people from groups that are different from the group you belong to, then in many cases you're less likely to have prejudice against that group. There's a lot of research on contact theory, and the literature I'm familiar with broadly supports this idea. So when you meet people who are different from yourself, you're less likely to have biases against them, right? But one problem here is that it's pretty difficult to find situations where people do meet across difference. The reason being that people tend to prefer to be with people who are like themselves. They tend to work with people who are like themselves. They tend to spend their own leisure time with people who are like themselves. So a big problem in this literature is how can we create situations where people meet across difference, all right? And myself and my colleagues, we were thinking that maybe the sharing economy will be one domain where people do meet across difference, and maybe Airbnb in particular, where you host people who are from different parts of the world, right? And I will assume that most people here are familiar with Airbnb, but if you have any questions about that case, please let me know and I can explain. So I will quickly just go over some existing research on Airbnb, and then I'll go on to discuss my own findings. And I'll be really brief here when I go over this. But so one question is, what do hosts want? So people who host on Airbnb, why are they participating in this particular platform? And the data tells us that they want money, which is not too surprising. They are motivated by the opportunities to make some extra money. They also are interested in the cultural experiences that they can have through hosting on Airbnb. So people who host on Airbnb, they do express that they like difference. They like encounters with the other. They like meeting people who are different from themselves. However, at the same time, data tells us that hosts discriminate. So in that sense, they dislike difference and they dislike encounters with the other. They prefer to host people who are like themselves. And this is quite a paradox, right? That people who host on Airbnb, they say they like difference, but they also say that they like familiarity. And I don't mean say as in they verbalize it, but we see that in the data. We know there's discrimination in Airbnb. We know that Black Americans are more often turned down than white Americans, for instance, just being one example. So when we have this paradox here, how can we explain that people like difference but also like familiarity? So this was a starting point for one of my research papers. And that, again, I apologize that the font is larger in this particular PowerPoint version, but I conducted interviews with 43 Airbnb hosts in Greater Boston. And the starting point was, how do people select their guests? How do hosts select their guests? And who do they want in their homes? And as you can imagine, it is really difficult to get valid interview data on discrimination. So again, we know from existing research that there is discrimination, but that is just a quantitative finding, right? But we don't really know much about how people think about the selection process. And that's what I tried to find out. And it's difficult to get valid data on this, and you cannot ask questions like this one, obviously, right? But you can get a sense of how people pick their guests if you ask them questions in a different way. If you ask this question, and you can ask hosts to share their best hosting experiences. You can ask them to share experiences they are not too happy about. And I did this with 43 hosts in Greater Boston, and based on the interview data I collected, you could get a sense of how discrimination actually works. So for the next part of the presentation, I will present a bunch of examples, a bunch of quotes from these 43 hosts, not all of them, but a select few of them. So I'll start with Marge, 26-year-old who lived in Cambridge in Boston. And I asked her to share one of her most positive experiences. I asked, can you tell us about one of your best hosting experiences? And she told me about a Chinese couple that was staying in her apartment in her guest room, and they were arguing. They were fighting. They were like bickering in the room. So this is a quote from Marge. And I was confused because I asked her to share a positive hosting experience, and why is this a positive hosting experience? And she told me that it was a positive experience for me because it felt to me like I was living in China. I felt like I was part of someone else's life in a way that is not really possible in any other way. So I had this couple living right next to me, and I sort of got a dip into their life. And she said that these uncomfortable experiences, they can really open your mind to unusual things or different things, and you build empathy towards difference as opposed to fear. And I was really surprised by this response to, again, the question was, what's your, can you give me a positive hosting experience? Right? And I think her response tells us a few things. It tells us that hosting the other can be awkward, it can be strange, it can be difficult, it can lead to some discomfort. But I think Marge was a case of what we call a genuine cosmopolitan, because she displayed a willingness to engage with real difference. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck, he wrote a book about cosmopolitanism. There's an anecdote in that book where he is up in the sky, flying somewhere, and there's a Danish businessman sitting next to him on his flight. And he asks this Danish businessman, are you a European? Do you consider yourself a European? And he says, no, I'm a world citizen. I'm a world citizen because I travel all over the world for my business. I stay at the same hotels, I eat at the same restaurants. So wherever I go in the world, I'm completely comfortable and at home. And Ulrich Beck uses this anecdote as an example of how you can be a full cosmopolitan. So that is not a cosmopolitan in this sense. Right? A genuine cosmopolitan would be someone who is willing to engage with the difficult kind of difference, to not engage with the kind of difference that is completely comfortable and completely familiar to you. And I think hosts like Marge, they tell us that there can be cases in the sharing economy where people can act as genuine cosmopolitans and have these experiences. So in a sense, that quote from Marge was really uplifting to me, and it does suggest that people can meet across difference. But at the same time, Marge was the only person in my sample who was like this. She was the only genuine cosmopolitan in my sample of 43 interviewees. Emilio is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. I asked him, how do you pick your guests? And he said, first of all, I look for the reason the guest has for being in town. I look for whether the person has an academic or hospital affiliation. I look for evidence of high quality English. I look for, if the person works in the tech startup world, that would be a positive sign for him. And he looks for someone who's been raised in a Western style environment. He also said, I've hosted a number of people over the years who come from cultures that are very different from my own. It usually leads to, I wouldn't say conflict, that would be overstating it, but it leads to discomfort. I hosted someone from, it was somewhere in Eastern Asia, and the food they cooked smelled awful. And he said, after he had some, quote, problems with 2 older guests, he said, now I'm like, no older people, you need to be young. And Emilio was, as I said, at the other end of the spectrum, and he was certainly more extreme, more blunt in how he talked about his discrimination and his racism. But I also appreciated his responses, because I think a lot of people in the sharing economy, they discriminate based on similar ideas. They just don't express themselves as bluntly as Emilio did. But most of my participants were like Hannah, most of my participants were between Marge and Emilio. I asked Hannah to tell me what her ideal guest would be like. She said it would be a young traveling girl, hopefully of another nationality, someone that I find a lot of common ground with, but is extremely different from me. Because I want to learn from them in a way. So I mean different race, different family upbringing, different culture, but similar as in age, love to travel, fundamentally educated, so we can chat. And again, most of my participants were like Hannah. They didn't necessarily articulate themselves in this particular way, but the patterns were there, that they like some difference, but not too much of it. So most of my participants, they told me that they enjoy social connection and cultural experiences. I'll give you one other example, and David doesn't articulate this pattern in the same way, but I think you can see the similarities between what David says and what Hannah just said. So I asked David, can you tell us about one of your best hosting experiences? And he told me that he really enjoyed spending time with my guests. I was really happy with how many Europeans were coming. And he struggled to give me a concrete example, not because there were so few of them, but because there were so many. But he eventually said there was a young couple from Munich. It was so fun. We got along so well. We were close in age and everything. And I think you can see here the same pattern. There's a preference for difference, but not too much of it. A German couple that are in the same age group, right? That's perfect for David. So hosts I talk to, they express a preference for difference, but also for familiarity. And I call this a preference for the comfortably exotic. And I suspect that you will find this if you talk to hosts in Korea as well, in other parts of the world. There will be a similar preference. What they consider a comfortably exotic guest will be different from place to place, of course, but I do suspect that you will find this in other parts of the world as well. Okay, so we now know a little bit about host preferences, but we don't know much about how they establish trust. And if you think about this, inviting a complete stranger to come to your home and to sleep in your home, in your spare bedroom, or even in the living room, they might be using the same kitchen, same bathroom, and so on. So you can imagine that you do need a certain level of trust for this to happen. So in another paper, I talked to the same participants about trust and how they establish that necessary trust. And I find that trust is structured in a particular way. It's structured in two concrete ways in Airbnb. So the first is that hosts, they make their decisions based on social credit data. So they make their decisions based on reviews, on Google data, or search engine data, I should say, and on social media data. This is pretty straightforward, so I'll just give you a few examples of these three. So Jenny, she told me that when men are coming all by themselves to my house, I feel very exposed and almost endangered. I really don't like to rent to people that don't have previous reviews. And a vast majority of my participants, they talked about how reviews are important to get a sense of personality and to get a sense of whether or not the person is trustworthy, right? Helen told me that she uses Google before she accepts a request from a guest. And she said you can find out a lot about a person on Google. Okay, so she accepted a guest who worked at Microsoft in Seattle, and she found this out by Googling, and she saw pictures of him, and that way she could know that he was in the hiking club, that he had bought a house a few years ago. So based on information she could find through Google, she could tell that this person was gainfully employed, had a quote normal hobby, and also had income. And she said, I felt like, okay, I know this guy is going to be a bit dorky and weird, but that's fine. That's a perfect candidate in my view. 26-year-old Omar told me that he would typically look up a potential guest on Facebook to, quote, make sure that this is a functional, this is a functioning individual in society. And this term is based on, is a Bourdieusian term based on French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. The point here really is that social credit is a resource, and it's a resource that is unequally distributed. Right? Some people will have a Google presence that is favorable to them, and some people will not. And I think Omar's quote is interesting because it suggests to us that you are sort of guilty until proven innocent, in a sense. So if you don't have a Google presence, if you don't have favorable data about you somewhere on the internet, then that's somehow fishy, a little suspicious. Why is there no information about you out there on the internet, right? Okay, so that's the first part of the structure of trust, as I call it. Second point is institutional trust. This is pretty straightforward. So I talked to Evan, who told me that the Airbnb insurance policy was pretty important to him. This is what I asked him. And he said, I find it very freeing to have the warranty policy, even though Lord knows if it actually works. And I'll get back to this point about whether it actually works or not. And he found it freeing because it gives me the peace of mind so that I don't have to rely on intuition. And I thought this response was pretty insightful because he's essentially saying that when you have a good policy, a good insurance policy in place, he doesn't have to judge his requestees based on the little information he has. He doesn't need to discriminate. That is essentially what he's saying, and that is how racism and discrimination works in the sharing economy. So when you force participants to make decisions based on the little information they have, even though they will not talk about it this way, this is how they would discriminate against people of color, people of low socioeconomic status, people who don't have social credit data, for instance. I talked to Casey, who was asked this question: are you ever concerned about what might happen when you host strangers off the internet? And he told me that he's not too concerned because if I'm the type of person that's going to rob somebody's house, and I know that Airbnb has my name, my phone number, my credit card information, where I live, and all that information, why take that risk, right? Why are they going to rob you when Airbnb has all that identifying information about you? But these findings tell us that intimate trade with strangers is facilitated by structural trust, by social credit data and institutional trust. These findings, they also tell us that home sharing really generates a world of opportunity. But there's an if, and it's a big if. It creates a world of opportunity for you if you're the right kind of different, and if you have good social credit score. So in Boston, for instance, the ideal guest is a Western European with a favorable Google presence. And this has obvious discrimination implications for discrimination. And I'll just mention a couple of potential solutions. I will not go into detail here at all, but one idea would be to improve the level of institutional trust. So as you saw from some of the quotes, Airbnb hosts, they really appreciate it when you have a functioning insurance policy. They really appreciate it when there's a proper identity verification system in place. And many did talk about how the insurance policy doesn't really work. So if you have a case where something goes wrong and maybe you have to pay $5,000 to repair something that was damaged, Airbnb might give you, say, $1,000. So it doesn't really work. And the people who have bad experiences with Airbnb guests, they don't really trust the policy based on their experiences. And it's the same with verification. It's pretty easy to circumvent the verification system. You can supply fake data, or you can just not submit information at all. Another solution is to make it harder to discriminate. So one paper found that some of the discrimination in Airbnb is based on the profile pictures, where you have people of color in the profile picture. This was an experimental design study where everything on the profile was identical except the profile picture, right? And if you think about it, you don't really need a profile picture to make a decision about whether or not you want to accept a guest. So to remove information that makes it easy to discriminate is another thing to think about. Okay, so a couple of takeaway points based on my Airbnb research. So the first is that the sharing economy does seem to bring people together. There are a few people like March, and people do like meeting people from different cultures. But at the same, and this works because the sharing economy creates a market for money making and social connection. So Airbnb is a really easy, convenient place to make some extra money and to make some connections. And people really do like Airbnb for those two reasons. But, and again, it's a big but, without thoughtful design and or regulation, my findings suggest that the sharing economy will simply reproduce social inequality. There is potential there for something else, but in the present state, Airbnb being the case, the sharing economy will simply reproduce existing social inequality. Okay, so that concludes the presentation I have. If you have any questions, you can, of course, talk to me after the presentations we have lined up, or you can also contact me at that particular email address if you'd like to. All right, thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 이 공유 경제 플랫폼 에어비앤비가 사람들에게 어떤 그 경제적 기회가 될 수가 있고 또 서로 차이를 가진 사람들이 서로 만날 수 있는 기회를 제공하긴 하지만 그 어떤 특정한 사회적 신용을 갖춘 이런 사람들에게만 우호적인 편향을 보일 수가 있기 때문에 사회적 불평등을 답습하는 그런 상황이 머무를 수 있다. 그래서 적절한 규제 또 플랫폼의 디자인이 그런 차별을 막는 디자인이 필요하다는 취지의 발표를 해주신 것 같습니다. 어떻게 공유경제가 앞으로 그 사회를 더 평등하게 만드는 그런 과제를 수행할 수 있을지에 대해서 좋은 조언이 된 것 같습니다.